Real questions, real answers for real life. Come on in and pull up a chair. You're at 1850 Main Street with Michael DelGiorno and David Zanotti.
Have you ever seen the documentary JFK, A President Betrayed? We're talking about it today here at 1850 Main Street.
So I'd like to take a moment and feel like a better person than you. You give me great old Mel Brooks comedies, and I give you a documentary that is, and let me say in terms of documentary, I remember you saying something to the effect of, well, you know, we can go back in a master's class and we can study speeches and we can study newspaper articles. Well, now we've had enough time pass where we can look at the actual memos and documents.
Yeah, that's a big
deal.
So
I called you and I said, I think you need to watch, and I know I get pinned as having an obsession with John F. Kennedy, but there's a documentary. It's available on Amazon Prime, JFK, A President Betrayed. You'll also love that Morgan Freeman and that magical voice is the narrator. But we have Khrushchev's son. We have Galbraith's son. I mean, we have all the key players, all the key documents, and it lays out something that I don't think my parents were aware was happening. And quite frankly, if anyone else had been president and he was the least likely to become president, I might not even be here doing 1850 with you. It was quite the eye-opener, and I want to get your big picture takeaway from having watched it, and then I'll share mine.
Well, none of us would be here. All right. If the people who thought it was time to blow the world up had blown the world up. There was conversation back in that period of time is if there's going to be a war, let's have it now. And the thought being that the U.S. had enough technological superiority that even though upwards of 300 million people could die globally, America would still end up ahead when it was all over. Now, that was part of the mindset.
What was chilling for me, though, because everybody knows about Bay of Pigs. And
well,
everybody knows.
I'm sorry. I sound so picky at this. I used to think the same thing. Everybody that pays attention and is 50 years or older knows about Bay of Pigs.
Yeah, none of this is, you're right. None of this is taught, but for those that follow. All right, so what happens is Castro overthrows Cuba. There was the whole communism domino type feeling. We don't want communists to spread. It'll always lead to world war, and we certainly don't want it anywhere in our region or our theater of the world. And so that was a big deal. Communist overthrow of Cuba and Castro. So by the time John F. Kennedy takes the oath of office, the plan is already in place to train and arm a militia to go in there and take Cuba back. If Richard Nixon had won, there would have been air support. John F. Kennedy won, no air support came. He wasn't willing to trigger a world war.
Okay, now stop right there. All right. Because does that mean that Nixon was a smarter, harder, more reasoned anti-communist than Kennedy was?
We can make that assumption on two fronts. One, Richard Nixon was Eisenhower's vice president for 8 years and therefore was at the table of all of this planning and on board with it like Eisenhower and planning to be, listen, when they were making these plans from Bay of Pigs to a nuclear strike on the Soviet Union, the presumption was it was either going to happen while Eisenhower was still in office or when Richard takes over.
But that seems like a tactical response point. Because I'm asking you philosophically, in his heart and mind, was Kennedy any less anti-communist than Nixon? Anti-communism.
Yeah, they both worked in the United States Senate on Cold War anti-communism issues. But I don't think he would have had, I don't think I would have had. I, to this day, can't tell you how Kennedy's gut was so different than everyone else's. And by the way, armchair quarterbacking, you can look back and say,
I got this one. I think I know the answer to that question.
Okay.
I think I know a big piece of it. In this documentary, one of the most stunning little asides was when Kennedy was elected and getting ready to be inaugurated. Of course, there's times where the existing president brings a new president in.
And briefed him.
And so it was interesting to see the picture where the oldest president in the history of the United States
standing next to the
was
youngest.
Turning over the facts and the figures and to the youngest president who had ever been elected in the United States. Now, another thing that will frighten us is how old Eisenhower looks. Now, remember, this was the commanding general.
Yeah, he was only 70.
He was only
you're right.
70 years old. And he was the oldest president.
They were a tough 70 years.
Tough 70 years, to be sure. Thank you, Ike, for your service beyond. All right. But then to this, and I think that when Kennedy looked at the world, he thought about his children. He wasn't thinking about his grandchildren. He was thinking about he had little kids in the White House.
Kids.
And he's thinking to himself,
profound.
wait a second.
It's profound.
They're the ones that are going to be blown up.
He said it.
Yeah.
All right. So they sit Kennedy down. What I was going to say about the Bay of Pigs is that's what the most
Which sounds like a really bad barbecue place to most people who have never studied it.
Well, it was an actually point of an entry for the invasion. But anyway, so that was in motion, and Kennedy approves it. The military was on board. CIA was on board. It was ready to happen. It just so fell on the transition of the presidency. So he gave it the green light. Things went terribly bad. Cuba knew they were coming, was waiting for them, was killing them, and there was no air support coming. And so Kennedy just took personal responsibility for the failure, but he didn't go all the way because he didn't want to start a world war over this. All right, that's Bay of Pigs. What people don't know, and it's documented, and you can read the documents now. They're no longer hidden and classified. Kennedy took office not with just the Bay of Pigs in motion. There was a plan to nuke the Soviet Union. We were going to take the first strike and take them out. That would have been 300 million projected loss of life in the Soviet Union because Khrushchev was that erratic
and
that threatening.
Khrushchev had a plan to hit us.
And then we find out they had a plan to hit us. Now, you take that. All right, so all the military's on board, all the CIA's on board. They come to Kennedy, and Kennedy goes, no. And then the Cuban Missile Crisis happens. Now you know why LeMay and the other generals are like, first of all, we shouldn't even be here. We should have nuked them by now. Now they're in our hemisphere. They have a first strike capability.
But there's
the devil's in our
another
backyard.
piece to this puzzle. And we got to keep this in perspective, of course, always. When the year the year Jack Kennedy was elected in Cook County and became president of the United States, was within 1 year's time was the Berlin Wall crisis. The Berlin Wall began to be constructed within 1 year's time.
Exactly. So, and Kennedy, you brought up two things that can't be rushed. Kennedy was always focused on Berlin. I think the documentary credits this, and I think it's important. Kennedy would always ask questions. David, you're an ask questions person, not a tell, not pontificate, not make your case. You always in life make your case by asking questions. Kennedy asked questions. And the questions that bothered the generals most was, especially Dean Acheson, who was, and he was right in that the Soviets only respected power, not rhetoric. You couldn't rhetoric your way. You couldn't diplomacy your way out. At the end of the day, they only respect if you threaten to punch him in the face. That's what they are. So, but he was a war hawk. But Kennedy would always go, and then what, Dean? What do you mean, then what? Well, if I do this, they're going to do something. If they did that to me, wouldn't I do something back? And he would pressure them with that. But at the heart of that, you don't know how wise what you just said was. At the heart of that was Kennedy's thinking Berlin and World War, and he's thinking of his two kids playing outside the window at the Oval Office. And I think that's what helped him. But what I found so fascinating is such a character as Kennedy. Like, what was Kennedy doing in Laos in 1953 as a U.S. senator? And then he wasn't just there visiting, doing photo ops. He's talking, he's listening, he's learning. And that's when he came and formed all of his conclusions, never knowing he was going to be president, that it's their war to fight. You can't interject. And then when he became president, and that was a crisis, he said no to Vietnam. He sent 40,000 to teach them, to advise them, but they were no way to engage in any kind of combat. And then the military tried to pull the wool over him and had some of them in combat action, and he pulled them. John F. Kennedy doesn't die, we're never in the Vietnam War. If John F. Kennedy wasn't president, we'd have taken a first strike against the Soviet Union. They would have responded, and probably 600 million would have been gone. And I think neither would be a superpower today. What gave him that judgment and discernment? What went into preparing that man for that time? He was saying no to everyone. with very little to justify it. And they perceived it as weakness. It ended up saving mankind.
It's halftime here at 1850 Main Street. Time to freshen up that cup of coffee. You can start every morning off right by listening to Your Morning Show with Michael DelGiorno. Tune in to stations across America and online at the free iHeart mobile app. Get a head start on the big stories of the day, every day, with Your Morning Show on the iHeart Network.
The difficult challenge about looking back at history and thinking that history is, we always have 20/20 hindsight, and we don't even always have 20/20 hindsight. There are still questions in all of this that are troubling. For example, right now, if you and I had this conversation was suddenly being overheard by a whole host of people that have a different school of thought, that are much, much deeper into conspiracies and into many, many forms of conspiracies. The irony in studying history is that the conspiracy is often in plain sight. The conspiracy is often a conflict over vision. It's often a conflict over ignorance. It's sometimes the conspiracy is just stupid. Sometimes it's as blind as ambition. And it does take us to the point where you and I were talking about what George Washington would call providence. The merciful grace of God that has managed to enable America to stay alive and growing in an understanding of liberty for for over 250 years. We go back to the 1600s, and how the long-suffering kindness and patience of God, a just and holy God, whom we have perpetually failed and insulted and walked away from. And yet he has perpetually continued to be gracious and kind. I don't know how he does what he does. I'm most grateful that he does. I don't know if it's
because his nature is so different than ours. Yeah. I think the most profound way I could say it is, if I was sitting in that room with Jack Kennedy, I'd say, Jack, those missiles are 90 miles away. They can strike 3/4 of America. We got to take them out. We got to invade so they don't bring more. I would have been wrong, and he wasn't. And they would have moved on Berlin, and we would have gone to World War. I don't see. That's why when I finished watching the movie, I wanted you to watch it so that I could look at.
You weren't alive during the
no, I would have never. I would have never existed. That's why I used me as an example. You would have actually died.
But let me tell you a story about that. I can remember all the kids in the household getting their baths, and it was a Sunday night. And instead of watching The Wonderful World of Disney, we were watching the President of the United States. And he was telling us about this crisis. And then, of course, obviously, our parents had to explain this to us. And I can remember my mother and father praying. And I can remember churches open and praying. And I can remember people of all kinds of denominations praying how they would pray, whether they were praying their rosary or whether they were holding prayer and fasting vigils. That people were praying. And I knew this had to be serious because I can never remember people praying about politics, praying about stuff going on in the world. Were we scared? We were both excited and scared because we'd never seen anything that had this much energy around it. So that seemed exciting. I mean, we're little kids, but was it terrifying? Yeah, it was terrifying. And I think unless you can, and so we were older than the president's kids, but I had a little sister that was as old as his kids. And this is the world in what we're talking about. Is there going to even be a future? I think that the weight of that alone was different than the people who had come through World War I, World War II, and had come through Stalin. And I think that they were so embittered. You know, we have to remember, Winston Churchill warned everybody to not trust the communists. He warned everybody to not trust Stalin. And those people walked past all that. And they were singed and they were burned by that. So they weren't going to get caught trusting the communists again. So it was, you think about the merciful providence of God, is that in spite of, forget Democrat, forget Republican, forget whether he was a hero, whether he was a heel, forget the Marilyn Monroe stuff. That just, I get all that. Humans are messy and sinful and awful, every one of us. Every one of us. But when it came to that moment, by the providential grace of God, we got through it.
Yeah,
and we were really close about 3 different times, 3 different ways to blowing this place up forever.
And by the way, the only thing I would get fleshly and defend, he wasn't weak.
Oh,
he would have followed through and taken out those missiles. He would have followed through and invaded. He would have followed through and gone to Berlin. He would have fought for the West Germans. He was not the greatest thing. And I don't know that this documentary covers it. I mean, it covered it, but not in depth with Khrushchev's son. Khrushchev thought he had a weak. He judged Jack Kennedy by Jack's father. Jack's father was an appeaser, which led to appeasement and the invasion of England by Hitler. He was wrong. He bullied him the entire time in Vienna. I mean, for 3 days, bullied him. And now Kennedy was in such pain, he would hide his crutches, but because he didn't want to project any weakness. And Kennedy listened and asked, talked and talked. Finally, they get by the car, and that's when he informs him, I'm building the wall. I'm stopping East Berlin. 2 things that were brilliant. Because first of all, this is like playing poker. You can say something, but you got to say it in such a way that it is believed. That's 1,000,000 to 1 odds. It's got to be just the right guy who has just the right ability. Kennedy didn't. He just smiled at him with his hands in his pockets and said, I think it's going to be a long, cold winter. And he just got in his car and left. Khrushchev did not know what to do with that. And his son says
Let's fast forward to the Reagan administration and to Reykjavik. Now, Khrushchev is gone. There's a whole different regime. Communism is now 20 years farther down the road, as is America. And everyone elects a president who they say is everyone. America elects a president. A lot of people voted for him, for Ronald Reagan. And everybody said he was a cowboy, he was a lightweight, he was a movie actor, he was going to blow the world up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If there was ever anybody who had the courage to push the button, if that's what it took, it was Ronald Reagan. And now we get to Reykjavik, and there's the summit between him and the Soviets. And what's going on at the table is not what Reagan wants to see happen. He knows it's dead wrong. And so he has the courage to get up and walk out on Gorbachev. He walks out in this London fog overcoat, right? Looking like every man, gets up and walks out and ends the conference and leaves the Soviets there at the table. He wasn't going to buy it. He wasn't going to bend. He wasn't going to yield. Now, nobody going into office knows if there's going to be a moment like that. Nobody voting for or against somebody knows if there's going to be a moment like that. And it makes the point that brings us back to the theme of your morning show. We may have all come here in different boats. We're all in the same boat now. We are in this together. And that's what's so troubling about the presidency today. It's built upon division. It's not built upon unity.
I left. There was one other moment that I thought was very striking. The moment when Kennedy looked at, I think it was Kenny McConnell. I think Bobby was there. I'm not certain if Dean Acheson was there. And he made the comment, and by the way, he's 44 years old when he says
Can
this.
you believe this? Yeah. This guy was like an 80-year-old, 44-year-old.
Yeah, he wise beyond his years, but when it came to this stuff. But he looks at them and he goes, we've lived a long life. Our kids haven't. And I thought that was so profound. The other is, I'd have been as wrong as Dean Acheson. I would have. The brilliance of John F. Kennedy, and he said this, that wall kept us from war too. Everything that you and I grew up, that wall became the symbol. I mean, all those people trying to get to West Germany from East Germany, where one is free and they're right across the street from each other, the other's enslaved. But that wall kept an armed battle from happening. So just by having that wall there and calming everything down, then you got to navigate the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then you got to convince them, as Dean Acheson said would never happen, that they would respond to something other than force. Kennedy convinced him. He somehow made, and then there's got to be some God on Khrushchev's side too, because he was ready to pull the button and he didn't. So I mean, I looked at the whole thing and I went, it's not John F. Kennedy we should be worshiping. It's not Khrushchev we should be demonizing. I'm telling you, almighty, all merciful God said it's not over yet. And he put the right people in place at the right time and interjected himself. Yeah. And then I stopped that movie and I thought, I got to talk to David, because where would we be if we didn't have George Washington, if we didn't have Abe Lincoln right when we needed Abe Lincoln, if we didn't have Kennedy, who never should have been, if we didn't have Reagan after Carter and all he created in Iran. And I'll throw in W for all the disagreements I have. There was nobody else on planet Earth I would have had be president after 9/11 than him. It's like God's always there when we need him, when the world needs him, when America needs him.
In spite of all of the stupid we do, there's a bigger plan. There is a bigger plan. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should take an Old Testament passage that says the Lord raises up kings and sets them down, because God doesn't vote in the American process. That's our job. I would suggest there's an even bigger theme to this, that even regardless of what we offer up as leadership, what we promote as leadership, God can still govern in the affairs of men. And if we are praying, constantly praying for God to have mercy on us, God does have mercy. He truly, genuinely does have mercy. He still cares about every life on this planet, regardless of how locked people are in the systems of their own mistakes. Whatever the system is that they call it, God still cares more about this world than we do. That's the thing we got to remember.
Let me take it from 30,000 feet right down before the wheels touch the runway. Could it be it wasn't Kennedy? It wasn't Khrushchev. And that's why it's so hard to break all this down and understand. It was if my people will humble themselves and repent and pray and call upon me, I will. The impossible checkmate, the almost impossible to avoid nuclear exchange. Could it have been the prayers of your mother and father?
And all those,
our grandmothers,
all
and
those little Italian women sitting in the pew doing their novenas, and all those Baptist women, and all those black women in their churches, and all those Jewish people praying. How do we know how heaven is besieged and God mercifully chooses to hear? And the other thing you bring up is he has a plan, and when he's done, we're done. But until he's done, we're not.
We're not done. And I'll tell you, because every time we do a conversation, it feels like, well, we gotta have some hope here. Well, I don't find it in $100 million to Charlie Kirk. I don't find it in whether or not my tax dollars are going to weaponize students on campuses.
And heaven knows I don't find it in anybody running for the presidency right now.
I find it in God fearfully, wonderfully made George Washington. And everything that happened to George Washington from childhood, through military, through his life, through marriage, prepared him to be the first of this experiment. And then somewhere in a new party, he creates Abe Lincoln for our most divided point. When we were and we didn't know it, they were ready to push the button on us, and we were ready to push the button on them. And I'm sorry, I think Nixon would have pushed the button. And he certainly he didn't get us out of Vietnam very fast.
How about the haberdasher? How about the haberdasher, Harry Truman? Where did he come from?
And then, Ronald Reagan, I always think of, because I don't know that
former Democrat cowboy actor.
There's two moments there's two presidents that were never supposed to be, John F. Kennedy and Donald Trump. One was assassinated. The other is character assassinated every day. And I pray that he's never physically harmed. But I go back to Reagan. Everything that Jimmy Carter had set us up for and foreign policy up for. Boy, if you'd have had 4 more years of Jimmy Carter, I don't know where we'd be. And then I would also say, if we'd have gotten Hillary after Barack Obama, we may already be sitting as a pawn at the table of a global governance.
I guess the one thing is, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and heal their land and forgive their sins. Now, forgive their sins and heal their land. Now, that was a promise prophetically uttered to ancient Israel. Christians in the modern era have picked it up and said, maybe if God would do that then,
he's the same God.
Maybe he would do it now. We recognize the verse in its context. It's not a magic wand, and it doesn't mean that God acts based upon what we do. God acts because God is God. The question is, are we asking him to act because we trust in his best interest and his providence?
And I would end with this. If you think we're in a bad place now, go to Amazon Prime, watch the documentary JFK, A President Betrayed, narrated by Morgan Freeman, because I got news for you. In 1961, we were in a much bigger pickle than we're in today. And the same God I'm trusting is going to be faithful again to provide us the right leader.
Did you know that you can hear Michael and David every day on Your Morning Show on the iHeartRadio network? You can tune in daily or log on live to the free iHeart mobile app. Get a head start on the big stories of the day every day on Your Morning Show. Then join us here where the conversation continues. Subscribe today so you don't miss a minute and visit 1850mainstreet.com to find out more. We'll see you next time here at 1850 Main Street.